Throughout history, there are moments when someone steps out of their front door, boards a train, or sets sail across the ocean, and simply vanishes without another word. No note, no trace, no body ever found. These are the disappearances that haunt our collective imagination, the cold cases that never close, the stories that leave us with more questions than answers. Imagine the sheer mystery of it. A person here one moment, gone the next, as if swallowed by the earth itself. It's the kind of puzzle that pulls at our deepest curiosities and fears, leaving families desperate for closure and armchair detectives searching for clues decades later. Today, we're diving into 25 of the most baffling, perplexing, and downright eerie disappearances from across the centuries. These are the cases that continue to puzzle historians, investigators, and everyday people like you and me. From explorers who ventured into uncharted wilderness and were never seen again, to passengers on ill-fated flights that seemed to dissolve into thin air, to ordinary individuals who stepped out for a walk and left behind only unanswered questions. Each story is a reminder of how fragile our presence in this world can be, and how easily a life can become a ghost in the archives of history. What makes these vanishings so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's the humanity behind them. The hopes, dreams, and unfinished journeys of those who disappeared. We'll explore tales of legendary figures like the lost colony of Roanoke, where an entire settlement vanished without a single clear clue, and the tragic fate of the Franklin expedition, whose ships were lost in the Arctic for over a century and a half. We'll also look at modern enigmas like the sudden disappearance of Flight Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, a case that captivated the world and still defies explanation. This journey isn't just about the facts, it's about stepping into the shadows of history and asking, what really happened to these people, and could such a thing happen again? So settle in, open your mind to the unknown, and join us as we uncover the stories behind history's most haunting disappearances. Our journey into the unknown begins not with a single person, but with an entire community that seemingly evaporated into the wilderness of the New World. In the late 16th century, England was eager to establish a foothold in the Americas, and a man named Sir Walter Raleigh spearheaded the effort. A group of about 115 men, women, and children landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, to form a settlement. Their governor, John White, soon sailed back to England for desperately needed supplies. His return, however, was delayed for 3 long years by an all-out war between England and Spain. When he finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, he found the settlement utterly deserted. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting a planned departure. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a fort's post, CROATOAN. A second, less complete carving on a tree seemed to read CRO. There was no sign of a struggle, no cross which was the prearranged signal for distress, and not a single colonist to be found. Among the vanished was John White's own granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Her disappearance only deepened the profound personal tragedy within this greater historical mystery. So what does that cryptic word, CROATOAN, actually mean? It most likely referred to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island, which was home to a Native American tribe of the same name. The colonists were known to have had friendly relations with the Croatoans, which fuels the most persistent theory that the settlers, facing starvation and harsh conditions, split into smaller groups and integrated with the local tribes. Over generations, they would have been absorbed into the communities, their English ways fading into history. Some later reports from Jamestown colonists spoke of Europeans living among natives in the region, and even of stone houses and children with gray eyes, but no definitive proof was ever found. Other theories are far darker. Perhaps the colony fell victim to a violent conflict, either with the hostile Secotán tribe or with Spanish soldiers who were known to be operating from Florida. Disease or a catastrophic storm could have also wiped them out, though the lack of bodies and the orderly state of the abandoned site makes that less likely. The most extreme speculation suggests a desperate attempt to sail back to England on their own led to their demise at sea. The truth is, we may never know for certain. The lost colony of Roanoke stands as America's oldest unsolved mystery, a ghost story written not in words but in the absence of them. It's a haunting reminder of how perilous those early ventures were and how easily an entire chapter of history can simply vanish, leaving behind only a single enigmatic word. From the silent forests of the New World, we now set sail into the vast, open ocean for a mystery that has become the very archetype of a ghost ship. In December of 1872, a vessel named the Mary Celeste was spotted adrift in the Atlantic Ocean between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. The crew of the British brig Dei Gratia recognized the ship immediately and knew something was terribly wrong. Its sails were partially set, some were missing, and it was listing slightly as it bobbed aimlessly on the gentle swells. After hailing the ship and receiving no response, a boarding party was sent over. What they discovered would become the stuff of nautical legend. The Mary Celeste was completely seaworthy, with a full 6-month supply of food and fresh water in its stores. The cargo, over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, was almost entirely intact. The personal belongings of the crew and the captain were all still in their quarters, including valuables and even the ship's cat. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of fire or flooding, and no damage to the hull. But the ship's only lifeboat was missing. Most eerily of all, the last log entry was from 10 days prior, and the navigational instruments were missing. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and the entire crew of 7 experienced sailors had vanished without a trace. They had simply walked away from a perfectly sound ship into the unforgiving Atlantic, and they were never heard from again. So what could have prompted such a desperate and ultimately fatal decision? One of the most compelling theories involves the ship's volatile cargo. Those barrels of alcohol could have leaked, filling the hold with flammable fumes. Perhaps the captain, fearing a catastrophic explosion, ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a temporary safety measure, tethering it to the Mary Celeste with a strong line. A sudden gust of wind or a rogue wave could have then snapped that line, leaving the occupants stranded in a small boat as their fully provisioned ship drifted away, forever out of reach. Other explanations point to the natural violence of the sea itself. The area is known for undersea seismic activity. A seaquake, a powerful tremor emanating from the ocean floor, could have erupted beneath the ship. The crew might have been terrified by the tremendous noise and the shuddering hull, mistaking it for an imminent structural failure, an abandoned ship only for the feared catastrophe to never actually occur. Or perhaps they fell victim to piracy, though this seems unlikely given the untouched valuables and cargo. The myth of a giant squid attack or supernatural intervention makes for a thrilling story, but the truth is likely far more mundane yet equally terrifying, a rapid, cascading series of misjudgments made under extreme pressure. The mystery of the Mary Celeste endures not because of what was found, but because of what was missing, any definitive answer at all. Leaving the ghostly decks of the Mary Celeste behind, our next story takes us from the high seas to the heat of a revolution and centers on a man who seemed to court mystery his entire life. Ambrose Bierce wasn't just any writer. He was one of the most famous and acerbic satirists in American history, a journalist known for his razor-sharp wit and a deeply cynical view of human nature. He authored classics like The Devil's Dictionary, a work filled with biting definitions such as describing peace as a period of cheating between 2 periods of fighting. By 1913, at the age of 71, Bierce was a literary legend, but he was also tired, grieving the recent deaths of his wife and 2 of his children, and seemingly bored with his life. So he decided to go on an adventure, announcing to his friends and publishers that he was heading south to tour the battlefields of the recently concluded American Civil War, and then, for reasons that remain unclear, continue straight into the heart of the ongoing Mexican Revolution. His journey began as a well-documented trip. He sent letters back to his secretary, some of which were published in magazines vividly describing his travels. In one of his last known correspondences, written from Chihuahua, Mexico, he declared, "I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." And with that, the trail of one of America's most cynical and clear-eyed observers goes completely cold. He was never heard from again. The most widely accepted theory is that he met his end in the chaotic violence of the Mexican Revolution. He had expressed a desire to witness the fighting firsthand, and it's plausible he attached himself to the army of the revolutionary leader Pancho Villa. A battle, particularly the bloody siege of Ojinaga in early January 1914, is often cited as a likely place for his death. An elderly American writer would have been a notable casualty, but in the fog of war and the sheer chaos of the revolution, his body may never have been identified or his death reported. But with a figure like Ambrose Bierce, a man who built his career on skewering hypocrisy and embracing the darker aspects of life, a more tantalizing theory persists that he stage-managed his own disappearance. He had the means, the motive, and the perfect personality for it. Deeply unhappy and feeling he had nothing left for him in the United States, he could have used the revolution as the perfect cover to simply walk away from his old identity and vanish. He might have chosen to die anonymously in some remote Mexican village, or even started a completely new life elsewhere under an assumed name. This idea is fueled by his own literary works, which often featured themes of mysterious vanishings and cynical twists of fate. It's the kind of enigmatic exit he might have written for one of his own characters. A darker, less common suggestion is that he was executed. Bierce was famously outspoken and critical of everyone. Had he insulted the wrong revolutionary officer or been mistaken for an American spy, a summary execution would have been a very real possibility. The truth is, we are left with the same unanswered questions that have lingered for over a century. Did Ambrose Bierce find the grand, dramatic death he might have secretly sought on a dusty Mexican battlefield? Or did he successfully pull off the ultimate escape, leaving his famous name and tragic past behind to become a true ghost in the machine of history? His disappearance remains the final, unwritten chapter in the life of a man who mastered the art of the dark and unresolved ending. Our next mystery transports us from the heat of revolution to the chilling, windswept isolation of the North Atlantic at the dawn of the 20th century. Off the western coast of Scotland lies a small, rugged archipelago known as the Flannan Isles, or the Seven Hunters. Its tallest lighthouse, perched atop Eilean Moor, was a vital beacon for ships navigating these treacherous waters. In December of 1900, it was manned by three experienced keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Jucat, and Donald MacArthur. Their routine isolation was shattered just days before Christmas when the steamer Archdor, passing by the island, noticed the lighthouse lamp was dark. Bad weather delayed any investigation until December the 26th, when a relief vessel finally managed to land on Eilean Moor. What the ship's captain and the replacement keeper found would become the cornerstone of one of history's most spine-tingling vanishings. The main gate and the door to the lighthouse compound were both closed. Inside, the clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the grate had gone out. In the kitchen, a chair was lying on its side on the floor, and sitting on the table was a cold, uneaten meal of meat, potatoes, and pickles, seemingly abandoned in haste. The keeper's oilskin coats and boots were still inside, a critical detail given the harsh weather. But of Thomas, James, and Donald there was not a single sign. A subsequent investigation uncovered the lighthouse log, which contained bizarre and frantic entries pointing towards a severe storm. The last entry, dated December the 15th, stated, "Storm ended, sea calm." God is over all. It was as if they had simply been plucked from the face of the earth. So what force could have compelled 3 seasoned seamen to leave their post without their protective gear, especially after the worst of a storm had apparently passed? The most widely accepted theory points to the raw, terrifying power of the ocean itself. The western landing on Eilean Moor is a steep, rocky chute where supplies were hauled up from boats below. Investigators noted that the railing and a box holding ropes and cables had been torn away and twisted out of shape, as if by an immense force. It is entirely possible that one of the men saw an enormous freak wave, a rogue wave barreling towards the island, and rushed out to warn a colleague working on the landing below. The second and third keeper would have then raced out to attempt a rescue, only for all 3 to be swept away by a second, even larger wave. This would explain the overturned chair and the uneaten meal they left in a moment of panicked urgency. Of course, a mystery this compelling invites more supernatural explanations. Local legends spoke of the islands being haunted by spirits, and some speculated the men had been taken by otherworldly forces or even mythical sea creatures. A more grounded, though equally dark, theory suggests a fight broke out among the men, driven by the intense psychological pressure of their isolation. Perhaps one went mad, attacked the others, and then threw their bodies into the sea before leaping in himself. However, the meticulous log entries up until the disappearance, which showed no signs of distress or conflict, and the fact that all 3 men were missing makes this seem less likely. The Flannan Isles disappearance endures because it is a perfect locked-room mystery set against a vast, unforgiving landscape. It's a story that forces us to confront the sheer, indifferent power of nature and the haunting silence left behind when it claims its victims without a single witness. From the storm-lashed isolation of a Scottish lighthouse, we now step onto the bustling, fashionable streets of early 20th century New York City, a world away in every sense but sharing the same profound mystery. Here, the story unfolds not of a sailor or a soldier, but of a beloved socialite whose everyday errand became a permanent vanishing act. Dorothy Arnold was the picture of American privilege in 1910. The daughter of a wealthy perfume importer, she was a Bryn Mawr graduate and an aspiring writer, moving in the highest circles of Manhattan society. On the afternoon of December 12th, she left her family's opulent townhouse on East 79th Street, telling her mother she was going to stroll down Fifth Avenue to buy a dress for her younger sister's upcoming debutante ball. She was last seen smiling and chatting with a friend near the Arnold home before continuing her walk south. She had about $30 in her purse, a significant sum at the time, and was dressed in a fashionable blue accented suit and a large velvet hat. It was the last time anyone from her world would ever see her. The Arnold family's reaction to her failure to return home that evening was shaped entirely by their social standing and a profound sense of denial. Initially, they assumed she had simply decided to visit a friend's house and would return soon. As hours turned into a full day, their private worry began to curdle into panic, but they were crippled by the fear of scandal. Instead of immediately notifying the police, they launched their own secret investigation, employing private detectives and questioning Dorothy's circle of friends themselves. They discovered she had indeed been to a bookstore on Fifth Avenue and purchased a box of chocolates, but she never arrived at the dress shop that was her stated destination. It was only after 6 weeks of frantic, fruitless, and utterly secret searching that the family finally, reluctantly, contacted the police. By then, the trail was stone cold. The investigation that followed was hamstrung from the start by this delay and quickly became a feeding frenzy for the press, who dubbed it the society mystery. The lack of any clear evidence gave rise to a whirlwind of theories. The most persistent one involved a secret romance. Dorothy was known to be seeing a man her parents disapproved of, a 40-year-old University of Michigan professor named George Griscom Jr. Some speculated they had orchestrated an elopement. though this seems unlikely as Griscom was reportedly in Italy at the time and equally bewildered by her disappearance. A darker possibility was that she met with foul play, perhaps a hit-and-run accident where the driver concealed the body to avoid responsibility, or even a kidnapping that went terribly wrong. The most tragic theory, hinted at by some friends, was that the deeply sensitive Dorothy, who had recently received a rejection letter for a short story she had written, was despondent over her literary failures and may have taken her own life. Yet, despite massive publicity and a hefty reward offered by the family, no body was ever found, no credible ransom note ever appeared, and no one was ever charged. The case simply evaporated, leaving behind a ghost of a story. The Dorothy Arnold disappearance is haunting not for its scale or its setting, but for its terrifying normalcy. A young woman stepped out on a sunny afternoon to do a bit of shopping in the heart of one of the world's greatest cities, surrounded by thousands of people, and simply ceased to exist. It's a stark reminder that a mystery needs no remote location or epic storm. Sometimes it can happen on a busy street in broad daylight, leaving behind only questions and a family's everlasting regret. Leaving the crowded streets of New York behind, our journey takes a sharp turn into the dense, silent woodlands of New England, where a series of vanishings would etch a new name onto the map of mystery, the Bennington Triangle. This area around Glastonbury Mountain in southern Vermont seems, by all appearances, to be a tranquil expanse of wilderness, but between 1945 and 1950, it became the stage for a chilling cluster of disappearances so bizarre and concentrated that they defy any easy explanation, earning the region a sinister reputation alongside the infamous Bermuda Triangle. The first in this strange sequence was the vanishing of a 74-year-old hunting guide named Middy Rivers. In November of 1945, he was leading a party of 4 hunters back to camp. An experienced outdoorsman who knew the terrain intimately, he walked ahead of the group just for a moment and was never seen again. An extensive search turned up only a single cartridge from his rifle. It was as if the forest had simply opened up and swallowed him. Just over a year later, the case that would truly capture the nation's attention unfolded. On December 1, 1946, an 18-year-old Bennington College student named Paula Weldon set out for a hike on the Long Trail. Dressed in a bright red parka, she was seen by several witnesses along the path. An elderly couple watched her walk around a bend in the trail just ahead of them. When they rounded the same bend moments later, she was gone. The red coat, which should have been a beacon in the winter landscape, was nowhere to be found. The massive search that followed, involving hundreds of students, police, and even the FBI, found not a single shred of evidence. The disappearances continued with a terrifying rhythm. In 1947, a 3-year-old boy vanished from a truck while his mother was collecting fiddleheads just a few feet away. Though his scent was tracked by bloodhounds, it stopped abruptly in the middle of a road. Then, in 1949, another student, James E. Tetford, seemingly evaporated from a moving bus. He was witnessed boarding a bus in Burlington, heading back to the Bennington soldiers' home. When the bus reached its destination, his luggage was still in the overhead rack. His folded bus timetable was on his seat, but James Tetford was gone. The final confirmed case in this grim series was the disappearance of 53-year-old Frieda Langer in October of 1950. She vanished during a hike with her cousin. Unlike the others, her body was eventually found 7 months later in an area that had been thoroughly combed during the initial search. The cause of her death, however, could not be determined. So what could possibly explain such a concentrated wave of inexplicable events? Some point to the region's long-held legends. Local Abenaki tribes referred to Glastonbury Mountain as the Enchanted Mountain and considered it cursed, a place to be avoided due to malevolent spirits and mysterious winds. This has fueled theories of paranormal activity, from UFO abductions to portals to another dimension. More grounded explanations point to the dangerous, disorienting nature of the terrain itself, a vast wilderness of thickets and sinkholes that could easily conceal a body. The possibility of a serial predator operating in the area has also been proposed, though no such individual was ever identified or linked to the crimes. The Bennington Triangle vanishings remain a profoundly unsettling puzzle, a case where logic seems to fail. It suggests that there are places in this world where the rules we depend on simply don't apply, and that sometimes the silence of the woods holds secrets it never intends to give up. Yet even the fog of war cannot obscure the shadow of darker possibilities. Another persistent theory suggests a tragic case of friendly fire. That same afternoon, Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers, returning from an aborted mission over Germany, were jettisoning their unused bombs into a designated area in the English Channel. This area was not on Miller's flight path, but what if his single-engine Norseman, struggling in the poor conditions, drifted off course? The grim possibility exists that Miller's plane was mistaken for an enemy aircraft and accidentally targeted, or that it flew directly into the path of this falling ordnance, being destroyed instantly without a trace. The Royal Air Force has consistently denied this, stating the bombing zone was clear and the timings do not align, but the theory endures for its horrifying plausibility. The most tantalizing theories, however, venture into the world of high-stakes intrigue. Glenn Miller's band was part of the Allied propaganda effort, and he was scheduled to travel to newly liberated Paris to perform for troops and for a radio broadcast. Could his disappearance have been an act of espionage? Some speculate his plane could have been sabotaged by Nazi agents, though this seems a complex operation for targeting an entertainer. A more cinematic, though less credible, rumor suggests that Miller didn't die over the channel at all, but survived the crash only to be killed in a Parisian brothel during a fight, with the entire story being covered up to protect the morale of the troops and the maestro's pristine image. While this makes for a sensational story, there is not a shred of credible evidence to support it. The most likely explanation remains the simplest and most tragic: the combination of terrible weather, a small, lightweight aircraft, and a pilot potentially pushing his limits to meet a tight schedule. The English Channel in December is a merciless place, and a small plane succumbing to icing, engine failure, or disorientation would have been lost quickly, its debris scattered and sunk by the churning cold waters. The official military conclusion attributes the loss to enemy action, a broad term that offers little comfort or closure. Glenn Miller's disappearance is a unique tragedy, a moment where the joyous soundtrack of a generation was abruptly silenced by the grim realities of war. He left behind not a body, but a legacy of music that continues to swing, and a mystery that lingers like the final, unresolved note of a haunting melody. On a chilly Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family of Fayetteville, West Virginia, was settling down for the night. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants, had put 9 of their 10 children to bed. Their oldest son was away serving in the army. Just after midnight, a thunderous crash followed by the smell of smoke jolted the house awake. A fire had erupted, and it was spreading with a terrifying, unnatural speed. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children managed to escape the blaze, fleeing to a neighbor's house for safety. But 5 children remained trapped inside: Morris, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5. The parents, frantic, tried to re-enter the burning home, but the heat and flames were too intense. The family could only watch in horror as their house was consumed, collapsing into a smoldering basement by dawn. When the fire finally died down, the desperate search for remains began. But what investigators found, or more accurately, what they did not find, would fuel a mystery that persists to this day. Despite the complete destruction of the home, the county sheriff and a volunteer fire crew discovered no trace of the 5 children's bones or teeth. This was immediately suspicious, as a house fire, even an intensely hot one, does not completely vaporize human remains. A funeral director present at the scene stated that it was impossible for 5 bodies to have been cremated so thoroughly. The official explanation was that the fire, fueled by the home's coal bin, had been hot enough to completely destroy the bodies, but the Sodders were not convinced, and their own investigation only deepened their belief that this was no accident. The strange inconsistencies began to pile up. The family's telephone line had been cut, and the wire was found severed some distance from the house. The ladder that was always leaned against the house, which George could have used to reach the children's second-floor bedrooms, was missing. Their 2 trucks parked in the driveway inexplicably wouldn't start that night, as if their electrical systems had been tampered with. Perhaps most chillingly, a witness came forward claiming to have seen someone throwing a ball of fire onto the Sodder roof just before the blaze began. George Sodder, who had been involved in vocal arguments with a local official over his criticism of Mussolini, even received a threatening note months earlier warning that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed. The family became utterly convinced that their children had not perished in the fire but had been abducted, and the fire was a cover-up. For the rest of their lives, George and Jenny Sodder devoted themselves to finding their missing children. They turned the property into a roadside memorial and offered a reward for information. They hired private investigators and followed up on countless leads, including reported sightings of the children. One of the most compelling tips came years later, when a woman claimed to have been in a company car with a nervous young man who confessed he had been one of the Sodder children, kidnapped and forced to live in an orphanage before being shipped off to Italy. The family even obtained a photograph in 1968, mailed anonymously, of a man in his 30s who bore a striking resemblance to their son Louis as he might have looked as an adult. They believed it was him, but despite their efforts, they could never locate the man in the picture or definitively prove their children were alive. The case remains officially closed, ruled a tragic fire. Yet the complete lack of physical evidence, the series of bizarre coincidences, and a family's unwavering conviction have cemented the Sodder children's disappearance as one of America's most haunting and unresolved cold cases. A heartbreaking puzzle where the only certainties are a parent's love and a quest for answers that would never come. Just a few years after the unsettling cluster of vanishings in the Bennington Triangle, a case halfway across the world would come to define the very concept of a heartbreaking mystery, forever altering the fabric of an entire nation. On Australia Day, January 26, 1966, the city of Adelaide was enjoying a perfect summer holiday. The beach at Glenelg was crowded with families under the brilliant sun. Among them were the 3 Beaumont children, Jane, aged 9, Anna, 7, and 4-year-old Grant. Their mother, Nancy Beaumont, had allowed them to make the short bus ride to the beach by themselves, a common and trusted practice at the time. She expected them to return on the 2 o'clock bus. When they didn't, she wasn't immediately alarmed, thinking they might have caught a later one. But as the 3 o'clock bus came and went with no sign of them, her concern turned to dread. By 5 o'clock, with the sun beginning to set and her children still missing, she contacted the police. What made the disappearance so profoundly baffling was the sheer number of witnesses and the complete absence of any clear evidence. The beach had been packed. Dozens of people recalled seeing the children playing. Several witnesses reported seeing a tall, thin, blonde-haired man in his mid-30s, wearing blue swimming trunks, playing with the children on the sand. He was described as acting in a familiar way, as if he were their father, and the children seemed comfortable and happy in his presence. Most critically, witnesses saw the 3 children leaving the beach with this same man at around 12:15 in the afternoon, walking away from the sand and toward the road. They were not struggling or crying. They appeared to be content and trusting. This single sighting became the core of the entire investigation, the last confirmed moment the Beaumont children were ever seen. The search that followed was unprecedented in Australian history. Police and hundreds of volunteers scoured the area for days. The sand dunes, nearby paddocks, and drainage pipes were all turned over. The case dominated national headlines, and the heartbreaking image of the three bright-eyed, smiling siblings was seared into the public consciousness. Despite the massive effort, not a single piece of clothing, a toy, or a shred of physical evidence belonging to the children was ever found. It was as if they had been plucked from the face of the earth by a phantom. The case triggered a palpable shift in societal norms. The innocent era of allowing children to roam freely was for many brought to an abrupt and fearful end. The Beaumont disappearance created a new kind of anxiety for parents, a collective loss of innocence for Australia. Over the decades, one suspect emerged as the most compelling, though he was never formally charged. His name was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a man already serving a life sentence for the horrific murder of another young boy in 1983. Von Einem was known to police as a suspect in other unsolved crimes against children, and his physical description in the 1960s matched that of the tall, blonde man seen at Glenelg Beach. Several witnesses even picked his photo out of a lineup years later. Furthermore, a witness came forward claiming that von Einem had once drunkenly confessed to having done the Beaumont job. However, without any forensic evidence to directly link him to the crime, and with von Einem himself never admitting to it, police could not make a case. The investigation has been revisited countless times, with numerous false leads and dead ends, including a famously botched excavation of a factory site in 2020 that yielded nothing. The disappearance of Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont remains Australia's most infamous cold case, a hauntingly simple story of three children on a summer day that ended in a silence which has never been broken. While the vanishing of the Beaumont children represented a national tragedy, our next disappearance is a story of international intrigue, set against the lush, misty backdrop of the Malaysian highlands. It centers on a man who was already a living legend, Jim Thompson, the American entrepreneur famously known as the Silk King of Thailand. After a remarkable career revitalizing the Thai silk industry and building a design empire, Thompson retired to a life of luxury and influence. In March of 1967, he was vacationing with friends at the Moonlight Bungalow in Malaysia's Cameron Highlands, a serene and beautiful hill station. On Easter Sunday, he decided to take a short walk into the surrounding jungle before afternoon drinks. He was never seen again. The immediate search was massive and involved everyone from local police to Aboriginal trackers from the Senoi people, renowned for their unparalleled skills in the jungle. They scoured every trail, ravine, and river for miles. Not a single footprint, broken branch, or shred of clothing was ever found. It was as if the jungle, which he had admired for its beauty, had simply absorbed him. The complete lack of any physical evidence was the first and most baffling clue. This wasn't just any tourist getting lost. Jim Thompson was a former Office of Strategic Services officer, the World War II precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, a man trained in survival and accustomed to navigating difficult terrain. For him to vanish without a trace suggested something far more complex than a simple hiking accident. This is where the theories truly begin to unravel. The most persistent one involves his intelligence background. At the time of his disappearance, Thompson was deeply involved in the art world and had extensive contacts across Southeast Asia, including in neutral Cambodia and Laos, hotbeds of Cold War espionage. Was he still working for the Central Intelligence Agency? Had he stumbled upon a secret or been targeted by a rival intelligence service? Some speculated he had learned of a plot against the Thai royal family and was silenced. Others suggested he was kidnapped by communist insurgents operating in the Malaysian-Thai border region, though no ransom demand was ever made. The sheer professionalism of the vanishing, leaving no trail, points to the possibility of a well-executed abduction or assassination, the kind only a state-sponsored actor could pull off. A more tragic, though less sensational, theory is that he met with a simple accident. The Cameron Highlands are home to dangerous wildlife, including tigers and venomous snakes. He could have fallen into a hidden ravine or been caught in a sudden landslide, his body quickly covered by the dense, rapidly growing vegetation. Yet, the expert trackers found no evidence to support this, and it fails to explain why a man of his experience would wander so far off a path as to never be found. Then there is the theory of a voluntary disappearance. Thompson's business was facing some financial difficulties at the time, and his personal life was complex. Did he use his old spy craft to engineer a completely new life somewhere else? If so, he executed it flawlessly, leaving behind his fortune, his legacy, and every personal tie without a single backward glance. The mystery of Jim Thompson's fate is as vibrant and intricate as the silks he made famous. It sits at a perfect crossroads, a capable man, a mysterious location, and a world simmering with Cold War tension. It begs the question of whether his past finally caught up with him, or if the jungle itself claimed its most famous visitor. His legacy endures in the beautiful Thai silk industry and his stunning Bangkok home, now a museum, but his final chapter remains a blank page, a puzzle wrapped in the dense green mist of the Cameron Highlands. Shifting our focus from the tangled jungles of Malaysia to the vast, open expanse of the South Pacific, we encounter a maritime mystery that rivals even the legend of the Mary Celeste for its sheer, unsettling peculiarity. In October of 1955, the merchant vessel Joyita set sail from Apia in Samoa, bound for the Tokelau Islands. On board were 25 souls, 16 crew members and 9 passengers, including a government official, a doctor, and 2 children. The trip was expected to take between 41 and 48 hours. When the Joyita failed to arrive on schedule, a massive air and sea search was launched across 250,000 square miles of ocean. For 5 weeks, nothing was found. The ship and everyone on it had been written off as lost. Then, on November 10th, a merchant ship stumbled upon the unbelievable. The Joyita was found, but it was a ghost ship in the most literal sense. It was drifting, partially submerged and listing heavily to its port side, its decks barely awash. And it was completely deserted. The scene that greeted the boarding party was one of organized abandonment layered with eerie clues. The ship was in a dire state. Its radio was tuned to the international distress frequency, but an examination found its wiring had been severed and the emergency generator was missing. The engines were still turning over feebly, though their rubber V-belts were broken and worn. A life raft and all life jackets were missing, suggesting a planned evacuation. But the most chilling details were found below decks. The ship's logbook, navigational chronometer, and all sextants were gone. Yet, in the pharmacy, medical supplies were laid out on a bench alongside a blood-stained bandage. This single piece of evidence suggested someone had been injured and was receiving treatment, but it was the only sign of any struggle or medical emergency. Even more puzzling was the cargo. The Joyita was carrying a large shipment of timber, and it was all still securely lashed down. Nothing of significant value had been taken. So what catastrophic series of events could explain this bizarre tableau? The official inquiry concluded the ship had encountered heavy seas, and its poorly maintained engines had failed. The initial theory was that the captain, fearing the ship would sink, ordered everyone into the life rafts. This seems logical until you consider the facts. The Joyita, despite its condition, was practically unsinkable. Its hull was made of double-planked mahogany and cork-lined, a design that gave it incredible buoyancy. It was found floating, proving it never would have sunk completely. Why would an experienced captain abandon a fundamentally sound vessel in the middle of the open ocean, exchanging its relative safety for the extreme peril of a small life raft? This is the central, baffling question. This core mystery has spawned a host of theories, each attempting to patch the holes in the official story. The most plausible involves a perfect storm of minor crises. A leak could have developed, and the failing pumps combined with the broken engines may have created the illusion the ship was going down. The bloody bandage hints at a possible injury, perhaps a man overboard or a serious accident that prompted a panicked decision to evacuate. Once in the rafts, the occupants would have been at the mercy of the currents and the intense South Pacific sun, likely perishing from exposure and dehydration. Other theories are far darker. The presence of a high-ranking official and a large sum of cash on board has led to speculation of mutiny or piracy, though the untouched cargo disputes this. Some have even suggested the crew fell victim to a sudden, violent attack by a giant squid or other sea creature, a theory as sensational as it is improbable. The most enduring local legend speaks of strikers, illegal fishermen who supposedly attacked the ship and killed everyone on board to protect their secret fishing grounds. The truth of the Joyita is that it presents us with a series of logical, individual clues that, when assembled, form a completely illogical picture. It is a riddle wrapped in a storm lost at sea. The 25 people who vanished that day made a choice that, from our vantage point, seems like a catastrophic error in judgment, leaving their unsinkable ship for an almost certain death and taking the real reason for that desperate decision with them into the deep. Just a few months after the jungle seemed to swallow Jim Thompson whole, another disappearance would shock the world, this time claiming one of the most powerful men in the Western world under circumstances so bizarre they seem ripped from a spy thriller. On a bright, sunny morning, December 17, 1967, the Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, decided to go for a swim. This wasn't entirely unusual. Holt was a known fitness enthusiast and a strong swimmer. He was spending the weekend at a beach house at Portsea, near Melbourne, with friends and political colleagues. The beach he chose, however, was Cheviot Beach, a place known for its dangerous, unpredictable rips, treacherous currents, and sudden drop-offs. As his friends watched from the shore, the 59-year-old leader waded into the surf. A large wave washed over him, and when it receded, Harold Holt was gone. The immediate response was one of utter disbelief, followed by one of the largest search operations in Australian history. The Royal Australian Navy, Royal Australian Air Force, police and army personnel, along with hundreds of local volunteers, scoured the coastline and the waters of Bass Strait. Helicopters buzzed overhead, boats trawled the area, and divers plunged into the rough, murky water. They searched for 3 weeks. They found nothing. Not his body, not his swimming trunks, not a single trace. The official conclusion, delivered just 9 days after his disappearance, was that the Prime Minister had drowned. He was declared dead in absentia, a necessary legal move that allowed his party to appoint a new leader. But for a nation and a world watching in stunned silence, the simple explanation of a drowning felt utterly inadequate. How could a sitting head of government, surrounded by people, simply vanish into the sea without a single piece of physical evidence? The vacuum of facts was instantly filled with a whirlwind of conspiracy theories, many fueled by Holt's own political standing. He was a staunch ally of the United States and a fervent supporter of the Vietnam War, having recently committed more Australian troops to the conflict. This led to the first and most persistent alternative theory, that he was secretly picked up by a Chinese submarine. The idea was that he had been a spy for Beijing all along, and that this was a pre-arranged defection, a spectacular escape from his public life. A variation suggested he was instead kidnapped by a hostile power. While creatively compelling, this theory holds virtually no water. Cheviot Beach is relatively shallow, making a submarine approach impossible without it being clearly visible to the many people onshore. Furthermore, no intelligence agency, then or since, has produced any evidence to support this fantastical claim. A darker, more domestic theory implicated Holt's own allies. Some speculated he had been assassinated by the Central Intelligence Agency. The reasoning was that he was preparing to pull Australian troops out of Vietnam, and the United States government could not allow such a crucial ally to waver. Again, there is no evidence for this. all historical records indicate Holt was one of the war's most vocal supporters, not a leader looking for an exit. Other, more personal theories suggested suicide, that the pressures of high office had become too much and he had chosen to end his life in a way that would look like an accident. Or perhaps it was a simple, tragic misadventure, a heart attack or cramp that struck in the water, rendering even the strongest swimmer helpless against the current. The most likely explanation remains the official one, though it does little to diminish the profound mystery of the event. Harold Holt, a confident swimmer, simply underestimated the raw power of the ocean that day. Cheviot Beach is notoriously dangerous, with powerful rips that can pull even the most experienced swimmer out to sea in a matter of seconds. His body was likely carried away by these strong currents into the vast, deep waters of Bass Strait, a body of water known for its rough conditions and abundant marine life. The sea, as it has done for countless others throughout history, kept its secret. The legacy of Harold Holt's disappearance is etched into the Australian landscape quite literally. The massive Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre in Melbourne was named in his honour. His vanishing act serves as a stark reminder that nature does not discriminate, that it shows no deference to title or power, and that sometimes the simplest explanation is the most haunting of all. Now we turn from the political intrigue of a prime minister's disappearance to a military mystery that would go on to fuel one of the world's most enduring legends, the Bermuda Triangle. The date was December 5, 1945, just months after the end of the Second World War. At the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a routine training mission was about to begin. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, known collectively as Flight 19, taxied onto the runway. Each plane carried a crew of 3, a total of 14 experienced airmen, most of whom were seasoned veterans recently returned from combat duty in the Pacific. Their instructor and flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a pilot with over 2,500 hours of flight time. The mission itself was standard, a 3-legged navigation exercise east over the Atlantic north and then back west to return to base. It was a flight they had all done before. The weather was fair, the planes were fully fueled, and the exercise was considered so straightforward that it was known as the Milk Run. They took off at 2:10 in the afternoon. They were never seen again. The first signs of trouble emerged less than 2 hours into the flight. Radio messages intercepted at the base began to indicate that things were going terribly wrong. Lieutenant Taylor's voice crackled over the radio, reporting that his compasses were malfunctioning. He believed he was over the Florida Keys, but the flight's last confirmed position placed them hundreds of miles to the east, out over the open ocean. He was disoriented and lost. "Both my compasses are out," he reported, "and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." The tower personnel tried to guide him, suggesting he fly west, but Taylor became convinced that flying west would take them further out to sea, a fatal misjudgment if he was actually over the Atlantic as believed. His final, haunting transmission was a conversation between the pilots, overheard by the base. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." After that, there was only static. The Navy immediately launched a massive search and rescue operation. A PBM Mariner flying boat with a crew of 13 took off from Banana River Naval Air Station to search for the missing Avengers. This massive aircraft, nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank for its volatile nature, was never heard from again either. It too vanished without a trace, adding another 13 men to the toll. A tanker ship off the coast of Florida reported seeing a tremendous burst of flame in the sky and an oil slick on the water at the approximate time the Mariner would have been in the area, suggesting it had suffered a catastrophic mid-air explosion. The official Navy investigation into the loss of Flight 19 could not determine a definitive cause. It concluded the planes likely ran out of fuel and ditched in the stormy seas that had rolled in that evening, and that the Mariner had been destroyed by an explosion. But the report also cited Lieutenant Taylor's confusion and failure to follow instructions as a primary factor, a conclusion his mother successfully fought to have changed to causes unknown. The true tragedy of Flight 19 lies in a cascade of simple, explainable errors. The most probable scenario is that Lieutenant Taylor suffered from a common yet perilous form of spatial disorientation. With his compasses malfunctioning, a not uncommon occurrence in that era, and with the sun setting over a featureless seascape that offered no visual landmarks, he simply lost his way. His insistence that he was over the Florida Keys, when all evidence and radio direction findings suggested he was far out to sea, sealed their fate. By ordering the flight east when he should have gone west, he led his entire squadron away from safety and deeper into the open ocean until their fuel was exhausted. The rescue plane's loss, while a separate tragedy, was likely a simple, if horrific, mechanical accident common to that type of aircraft. Yet, the sheer improbability of losing 6 planes and 27 men on a single, clear afternoon captured the public's imagination. The story was too powerful, too mysterious to be left to mere human error. It needed a grander, more sinister explanation, and thus the legend of the Bermuda Triangle was born, with the Lost Patrol of Flight 19 as its foundational ghost story. Our journey now takes us from the open ocean into the very heart of the world's greatest rainforest, where the lines between myth and reality blur into a dense green haze. Here, the story is not of a sudden vanishing, but of a deliberate, calculated walk into the unknown by a man who was arguably one of the most intrepid explorers of the 20th century. Lieutenant Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett was a British artillery officer turned explorer, a man whose reputation was built on sheer toughness and an almost supernatural ability to survive in the most hostile environments. He had undertaken multiple mapping expeditions for the Royal Geographical Society deep into the uncharted regions of the Amazon basin, areas so remote that they were still labeled on maps as unexplored. He had fought off hostile tribes, endured debilitating diseases, and witnessed wonders that few outsiders had ever seen. But it was on his final expedition in 1925 that he sought the greatest prize of all, a lost city he referred to simply as Z. Fawcett was no dreamer chasing fairy tales. His belief in a sophisticated, ancient civilization hidden in the Brazilian jungle was based on fragments of evidence, old Portuguese manuscripts, tantalizing rumors from indigenous tribes, and his own discovery of strange artifacts and inscriptions during his previous travels. He theorized that a complex culture, which he called the City of Z, had once thrived in the Amazon and then vanished, its stone ruins waiting to be rediscovered. He assembled a small, hand-picked team for this ultimate quest, believing a large party would attract unwanted attention and be cumbersome. His companions were his greatest pride and his ultimate vulnerability, his 21-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's best friend, Rolly Rimmel. Their final communication to the outside world was a letter dispatched from a remote outpost called Dead Horse Camp, in which Fawcett wrote with characteristic confidence, "We hope to get through this region in a few days. You need have no fear of any failure." It was the last anyone ever heard from them. The silence that followed was initially not alarming. Fawcett had warned that he might be out of contact for years. But as months stretched into a year, then too, concern grew into outright alarm. The mystery of his fate quickly captured the global imagination, sparking what would become one of the largest and most deadly manhunts in history. Over the next decades, more than 100 expeditions comprising thousands of adventurers would plunge into the jungle in search of answers. At least 100 of these would-be rescuers would themselves perish from disease, animal attacks, or at the hands of hostile tribes, adding to the grim legend of Fawcett's disappearance. This tragic toll earned the search the nickname, the greatest exploration mystery of the 20th century. So what truly happened to Percy Fawcett and his two young companions? The most widely accepted theory is also the simplest. They fell victim to the jungle itself. The area they were traveling through was, and in many ways still is, immensely treacherous. They could have succumbed to any number of tropical diseases like malaria or yellow fever. A common and grim possibility is that they drank from a contaminated water source and died from illness or poisoning. They could have been killed by a jaguar or a venomous snake, or, in a cruel twist of irony, the great navigator may have simply gotten lost, his legendary sense of direction finally failing him in the featureless green maze, leading to death by starvation or exposure. A second, more dramatic theory points to violence. Fawcett was known to be disdainful of many indigenous tribes, believing his sheer force of will and reputation would protect him. He may have gravely miscalculated and trespassed onto the lands of a particularly hostile group, like the Kalapalo people, who have their own oral history of the event. According to their accounts passed down through generations, the small party was warned to turn back but refused. The tribesmen, seeing them as a threat, then killed them. Some versions of this story suggest the older Fawcett was killed first, and the two younger men were then adopted into the tribe for a time before also being killed. While these stories are compelling, they are difficult to verify after so much time. Perhaps the most romantic theory, one that Fawcett himself might have preferred, is that he actually succeeded. That he found his lost city of Z and chose to stay there, adopting a new life among its people and severing all ties with the outside world. This idea of a voluntary disappearance was fueled by sporadic, unverified reports over the years of a tall, blue-eyed white man living like a chief among a remote tribe. While there is no solid evidence for this, it speaks to the powerful allure of Fawcett's dream. His disappearance was not an end but a transformation. He became a permanent part of the very mystery he sought to solve, a ghost in the green cathedral of the Amazon, forever urging others to wonder what secrets still lie hidden in the world's last uncharted corners. From the treacherous Amazon to the even more unforgiving sky, our next disappearance lifts the mystery high above the base, straight into the realm of the truly unexplained. On the night of October 21, 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Melbourne in a single-engine Cessna 182. He was on a routine training flight to King Island, a trip that should have taken less than an hour over the open water. The weather was clear, his aircraft was in good working order, and he was an enthusiastic, though relatively inexperienced pilot. What happened next was captured in a chilling 6-minute radio transmission with air traffic control in Melbourne, a recording that would become one of the most debated audio documents in aviation history. The conversation began normally, with Valentich checking in and confirming his altitude. Then his tone shifted. He reported an unidentified aircraft following him, flying about 1,000 feet above. When the controller replied that there was no known traffic at that altitude, Valentich's voice took on a note of confusion and then growing alarm. He described the object as large, metallic, and illuminated by 4 bright landing lights. It was not an aircraft as he knew it, he insisted. He then reported that the strange craft was orbiting above him, moving at incredible speed. The controller, increasingly perplexed, could only ask for more details. The transmission became punctuated with tense silences and static. Then came the final, hair-raising statements from Valentich. His engine was beginning to cough and run rough, a failure he directly linked to the presence of the unknown object. His last words, now famous around the world, were a series of broken, frantic phrases. "That strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering and it's not an aircraft." The transmission ended with 17 seconds of loud, metallic scraping sounds before cutting to absolute silence. Frederick Valentich and his Cessna had vanished. The official investigation by the Department of Transport was thorough but inconclusive. They could find no evidence of what happened to the young pilot. No debris from the plane was ever recovered from the base strait despite extensive searches. This complete lack of physical evidence only served to fuel the intense speculation that erupted around the case. The debate essentially fractured into three distinct camps, each with its own compelling arguments. The first and most sensational theory is that Valentich was the victim of a genuine unidentified flying object, an extraterrestrial craft that either caused his engine to fail or perhaps even abducted him and his plane. Proponents of this view point to the clear, real-time description from a trained pilot and the eerie, unexplained noises that close the transmission as definitive proof of an otherworldly encounter. The second theory suggests a tragic case of disorientation compounded by inexperience. It is possible that Valentich, flying over featureless water on a dark night, became spatially disoriented. He may have mistakenly seen the lights of Venus or Jupiter, which were both bright and visible that evening, and misinterpreted them as a craft following him. In a state of growing panic, he could have inadvertently put his own plane into a dive while trying to get a better look at the object, which would have been his own reflection or the planet's light seemingly mirroring his movements. The rough-running engine could have been him accidentally richening the fuel mixture in his anxiety, and the final scraping sounds could be the plane impacting the water. This theory posits that he essentially talked himself into a catastrophic accident, a victim of his own imagination and the perilous phenomenon of vertigo. The third and most cynical explanation is that the entire event was an elaborate hoax. Critics point to Valentich's well-documented fascination with UFOs and suggest he staged his own disappearance. Perhaps he ditched the plane successfully and was picked up by a pre-arranged vessel intending to start a new life elsewhere. The bizarre radio transmission in this scenario was a dramatic performance designed to cover his tracks and create a lasting myth. However, this theory fails to explain how he could have pulled off such a feat over open ocean with no body or wreckage ever washing ashore, and it seems an incredibly risky and complex plan for a young man with no known motive to vanish. The truth of what happened to Frederick Valentich remains locked in that final, static-filled transmission. It is a chilling audio snapshot of a man seemingly encountering the utterly inexplicable, a mystery that hangs in the air over the base, straight as palpable and unresolved as it was on that October night. But the vanishing of the Springfield Three is a story that stands apart, a case that feels less like a historical artifact and more like an open wound in a small community. It's a mystery that unfolded not in some remote wilderness or on the high seas, but in a tidy suburban home on a quiet street, leaving behind a scene of such mundane normality that its very emptiness became the most terrifying clue of all. On the morning of June 7, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri, friends and family began to worry. Sue Streeter had been trying to reach her daughter, 19-year-old Suzanne, all morning without any luck. She'd last been seen the night before, celebrating her high school graduation with friends. When a friend arrived at the home Sue shared with 47-year-old Cheryl Levitt, they found the door unlocked. Inside, everything seemed perfectly normal, yet deeply wrong. The coffee pot was on, a half-drank soda sat on the counter, and cigarettes were left burning in an ashtray. Both women's purses, complete with their identification and cash, were lined up neatly on the living room couch. Their cars were still parked in the driveway. But Cheryl, Suzanne, and Suzanne's friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall, who had stayed the night after the graduation parties, were gone. The only sign of anything amiss was a broken glass porch light globe, its fragments scattered on the welcome mat below. The investigation that followed was immediately massive and has remained persistently frustrating. This was not a case of someone simply walking away. 3 women had seemingly evaporated into the night from our occupied home, leaving behind everything they would need to survive: their money, their keys, their medicines. It suggested an event of overwhelming and sudden force, an abduction so swift and efficient that it left no time for a struggle or a cry for help. The broken porch light offered a chillingly simple theory. Perhaps the abductor unscrewed the bulb and smashed the globe to plunge the entrance into darkness, allowing them to approach the door unseen. The police pursued thousands of leads, from tips called in by psychics to a possible connection with a serial killer operating along nearby Interstate 44. They excavated the basement of a local hospital based on a dubious rumor, and even considered a theory involving a vengeful drug dealer, though none of the women had any significant history with that world. Perhaps the most bizarre twist came days after the disappearance. An anonymous caller contacted the Crime Stoppers tip line and issued a series of cryptic, taunting commands, directing investigators to specific locations around the city. The calls, which were recorded, led searchers to a parking lot and a remote field, but each time they found nothing. The voice, later analyzed by experts, was deemed to be a genuine lead, a cruel person who seemed to know something about the crime, but their identity and motives were never uncovered. As the years passed, the case grew colder, but it never closed. The families of the three women have endured a special kind of hell, trapped in a state of agonizing uncertainty. They have lived through false hopes, like the time in 1994 when 3 bodies were found in a nearby quarry, only for dental records to confirm they were not the missing women. The sheer normality of the scene they left behind is what continues to haunt the public imagination. It's a stark, terrifying reminder that the comforts of home are no guarantee of safety, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries begin not with a bang, but with the quiet, unsettling discovery of an unlocked door and a life interrupted. And now we journey back to the very dawn of moving pictures, to a time when the magic of capturing life itself was still a fragile dream pursued by a handful of visionary inventors. Our story centers on a man who should be a household name, Louis Le Prince. In 1888, years before Thomas Edison or the Lumiere brothers would showcase their devices, this French innovator successfully shot the world's first ever motion picture sequences on a single-lens camera of his own ingenious design. His short films, like the serene Roundhay Garden scene, captured real people in motion, and they still exist today as a flickering testament to his groundbreaking work. Le Prince was on the cusp of global fame and immense fortune, preparing to cross the Atlantic for a grand public demonstration of his invention in New York. He was, by all accounts, poised to be crowned the undisputed father of cinematography, but history took a sharp, mysterious turn. In September of 1890, Le Prince boarded a train in Dijon, France, to visit his brother in Paris before continuing to his triumphant debut. He was seen placing his luggage into his first-class compartment. When the train pulled into the Paris station, that compartment was empty. Louis Le Prince, along with his valise containing the patent papers for his camera, had vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed was as baffling as it was frantic. French authorities scoured the railway line, searching every inch of track between Dijon and Paris. They questioned every passenger and railway employee they could find. Not a single clue emerged. There was no sign of a struggle in his compartment. No body was discovered along the route, and his luggage, which held the very documents that could secure his legacy, was never recovered. It was as if he had simply stepped through a door into another dimension, leaving behind only a profound and eerie silence. The most promising theory, and the one that carries the whiff of a classic thriller, points directly to his rivals in the intensely competitive race to patent motion pictures. Thomas Edison's laboratory was working feverishly on their own devices, the kinetoscope and the kinetograph, and the commercial stakes were unimaginably high. The American inventor had a well-documented reputation for aggressive business tactics and fiercely protecting what he considered his intellectual territory, even employing lawyers to fight protracted and expensive patent wars. Did Edison or agents working on his behalf see LaPrince as an existential threat that needed to be eliminated before he could secure his patents in the United States? It's a theory that has persisted for over a century, suggesting industrial espionage that escalated into murder. While no direct evidence has ever linked Edison to the crime, the timing is certainly suspicious, and the beneficiary of LaPrince's disappearance was unequivocally the Edison Manufacturing Company, which would go on to commercially dominate the early film industry. Yet other possibilities, though less cinematic, are equally plausible. Could LaPrince, under the immense pressure of his impending launch and fraught with personal debt, have chosen to stage his own disappearance? It seems an extreme measure for a man on the verge of realizing his life's ambition, but the stress of potential failure can drive people to desperate acts. Perhaps he suffered a sudden, tragic accident, falling from the train due to a faulty door or a sudden lurch. If his body fell into a river or was obscured by dense foliage, it might never have been found. There's even a strange, later twist to the tale. In 1898, over 7 years after he vanished, the New York Police Department fished the body of a drowning victim from the East River. The man had reportedly shot himself, and through a series of bureaucratic errors, he was misidentified and buried in a pauper's grave. A decade after that, a photograph of the dead man was shown to LaPrince's family, who believed it was him. If true, it would mean he did make it to New York after all, only to meet a different, sorrowful end. But this story is riddled with inconsistencies and has never been verified. The enduring mystery of Louis LaPrince is a profound what-if of history. His vanishing act effectively erased him from the narrative, allowing others to claim the glory he had rightfully earned. He remains a ghost in the machine of his own creation, the man who invented the movies but disappeared before the opening credits could ever roll. Leaving the unresolved suburban mystery of the Springfield Three behind, we now journey into a vastly different kind of emptiness, one of howling wind and deep snow, to a place that has become synonymous with unspeakable horror, the Dyatlov Pass. In the bitter winter of 1959, a group of 10 experienced ski hikers, mostly students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, set out on an expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. Their leader was a 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov, a man known for his rigorous preparation and skill. The trek was so challenging it was designated Category 3, the highest level of difficulty in the Soviet hiking system. These were not tourists, they were tough, knowledgeable outdoors people equipped for the severe conditions. On February 1st, they began their ascent of the mountain known locally as CROATOAN, which chillingly translates to Mountain of the Dead. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive. When the group failed to send a scheduled telegram by February 20th, worried relatives initiated a search. What the rescue teams discovered on February 26th would launch a mystery that has captivated and horrified the world for over 6 decades. They found the group's tent on the mountainside, but it had been cut open from the inside. The slashes were large, as if made in a frantic hurry, and the skis, boots, and warm clothing had all been left behind. This alone was utterly illogical. To abandon your tent in sub-zero temperatures without proper gear was a guaranteed death sentence. The searchers then began to find the bodies, scattered in the snow between the tent and a nearby forest, some over a kilometer away. The first 2 were discovered near the remains of a small fire, dressed only in their underwear. 3 more were found between the fire and the tent, seemingly frozen while trying to return to its shelter. The condition of these 5 suggested death by hypothermia, a tragedy but perhaps explainable. The final 4 bodies, however, were not discovered until over 2 months later, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine. Their injuries were not from the cold. They were catastrophic, massive chest trauma, equivalent to the force of a high-speed car crash, and 1 hiker was missing her tongue. The official Soviet investigation, hastily closed within months, concluded the group had met with a compelling natural force. Case closed, but this vague explanation only fueled decades of speculation, giving rise to theories that range from the plausible to the paranormal. The most widely accepted modern theory involves a rare slab avalanche. Proponents suggest that a layer of snow on the steep slope above the tent may have fractured, sliding down and striking the hikers as they slept. The force could have caused the severe internal injuries, and the confusion and concussion from the impact might have prompted them to slash their way out of the tent in a disoriented panic, fleeing into the deadly cold. This theory gained significant traction after a 2020 study used computer modeling to show how such an avalanche was possible. However, skeptics point out that the slope was not particularly steep. Other experienced hikers had camped in the same area without incident, and no evidence of a slide, like disturbed snow or debris, was documented by the original investigators. This lack of a perfect natural explanation has invited more exotic possibilities. The presence of heightened levels of radiation on some of the victims' clothing led to theories of a secret military test, perhaps of a new weapon or a crashed missile, and that the hikers were accidental witnesses who had to be silenced. Others point to the indigenous Mansi people, suggesting a conflict, though there was no evidence of a struggle and the injuries were not consistent with an attack. The more fringe theories delve into the truly bizarre: attacks by Yetis, UFO encounters, or even malevolent Soviet experiments with psychological weapons. A particularly compelling scientific theory involves infrasound low-frequency sound waves inaudible to humans that can be generated by strong winds passing over specific geographical formations. This kind of sound can induce feelings of sheer terror, panic, and even physical illness in people. It's possible the group, trapped in their tent by a fierce katabatic wind, was subjected to an infrasound assault that triggered an irrational, primal flight response, causing them to flee in blind horror directly into the lethal environment. The enduring power of the Dyatlov Pass Incident lies in this perfect storm of unanswered questions. It presents us with a series of clear physical facts: a slashed tent, scattered bodies, horrific injuries that refuse to coalesce into a single, satisfying narrative. It is a forensic puzzle where every solution seems to create a new question. Why did they leave in such a hurry? What caused injuries that a leading forensic expert stated were unlike anything he'd seen outside of a major disaster? The case remains a cold, dark hole in history, a stark reminder that even the most experienced among us can be rendered utterly vulnerable by forces we may never fully understand, whether they are of this earth or something far more strange and unsettling. Yet another wealthy and powerful man vanishes just as his life reaches a pivotal moment, leaving behind a fortune and a trail of suspicion that would never grow cold. On December 2, 1919, Canadian theatre magnate Ambrose Small completed the business deal of a lifetime. He sold his vast empire of theatres, a chain that stretched across Ontario, for a sum equivalent to over $20 million in today's money. The cash was deposited into his account at the Canadian Bank of Commerce in Toronto. That evening, he was seen at his office going over some final details. He then met with his wife, Teresa, and together they went to the Grand Opera House, one of the crown jewels of his theatrical holdings, to collect a $10,000 donation for the Catholic Church. Afterwards, he returned to his office to retrieve his overcoat, and at around 5:45 in the evening, he told his secretary he was going out for a walk. Ambrose Small, one of the most recognizable and influential men in Canada, stepped out onto Yonge Street and vanished into the twilight, never to be seen again. The initial reaction was not one of immediate panic. Small was a flamboyant and sometimes volatile character, known for his temper and his erratic behavior. It was thought he might have simply taken a sudden trip to blow off steam after the stressful sale. But as days turned into weeks with no word, and with that immense fortune sitting untouched in his bank account, the reality of his disappearance sank in. The investigation that followed was a spectacle in itself, fueled by a $50,000 reward offered by his wife. It quickly became a media frenzy, with every tip and rumor splashed across the front pages. The case was a Pandora's box of motives and potential suspects, each theory more compelling than the last. The first and most obvious person of interest was his wife, Teresa Small. Their marriage was known to be deeply troubled and fraught with arguments. Ambrose was a notorious womanizer, and Teresa had reportedly threatened him in the past. The fact that she stood to inherit his entire fortune provided a powerful motive. Yet, she was the one who pushed the police the hardest to investigate and offered the enormous reward, behavior inconsistent with someone who had orchestrated a murder. Then there were his business associates. The sale of the theater chain was complex and had made enemies. Had Small double-crossed someone in the deal? Was he killed by a rival businessman or perhaps by someone within his own organization who felt cheated? The theory of a professional hit was always on the table, given the clean and absolute nature of the vanishing. This leads to the other persistent theory, that Ambrose Small orchestrated his own disappearance. He was a man under immense pressure, trapped in a bad marriage, and suddenly in possession of a life-changing amount of money. Did he decide to simply walk away from it all? Perhaps he had a secret plan to retrieve the money later from a different location under a new identity. The problem with this theory is that he never touched a cent of it. The fortune remained in the bank, gathering dust for the rest of his wife's life. If it was a plan to start over, it was a plan he never activated, which makes the voluntary disappearance theory feel incomplete at best. Over the decades, the case took on a macabre and almost gothic life of its own. Tips poured in for years, from psychic visions to deathbed confessions, but none led to a body or a conviction. The most famous clue emerged years later, when a convicted murderer and bank robber named John Doughty, who had been Small's former secretary, confessed to the crime. He claimed he had been alone in the office with Small. They had argued over a $500 bonus he felt he was owed from the big sale, and in a fit of rage he struck and killed him. He then allegedly dragged the body to the furnace room of the Grand Opera House and incinerated it. While this confession seemed to solve the mystery, it was riddled with inconsistencies. He couldn't accurately describe the layout of the building's basement, and no physical evidence was ever found to corroborate his story. The police ultimately did not charge him, leaving his confession as just another eerie, unverified chapter in the legend. The disappearance of Ambrose Small is a classic locked-room mystery played out on the scale of an entire city. It has all the elements of a perfect crime thriller: wealth, infidelity, powerful suspects, and a body that was never found. It remains Canada's most famous cold case, a ghost story written not in a remote wilderness, but in the heart of its largest city, a permanent question mark in the nation's history. While the Dyatlov Pass Incident presents a mystery forged in ice and Soviet secrecy, our next case unfolds under the brilliant, unflinching sun of the Australian coast, offering a modern maritime puzzle that feels ripped from a Twilight Zone episode. In April 2007, a routine aerial patrol spotted a sleek, white catamaran drifting aimlessly in the vast, sapphire expanse of the Great Barrier Reef. As the helicopter drew closer, the crew noted something was immediately wrong. The vessel, named the Kaz II, was sailing perfectly. Its sails were up and slightly furled, its engine was still running, and it was towing a dinghy. But there was no one at the helm. A rescue team was sent to board the ghost ship, and what they discovered inside was a scene of surreal and profound normalcy that made the absence of its crew all the more disturbing. On the table below deck, a meal was set out as if someone was about to sit down to eat. A laptop computer was open and powered on. The crew's personal effects, their wallets, and their passports were all neatly stowed away. The radio was functional and tuned to the local weather channel. There was even a pair of shoes left sitting on the deck. It was as if the three men on board, Des Batten, his brother Peter, and their friend James Tunstead had simply walked away from their lives in the middle of a calm, sunny day. But of the experienced sailors themselves, there was not a single trace. No distress signal had been sent, no life raft had been deployed. The only clues to any trouble were a torn sail and a fishing line that was still trailing in the water behind the boat. The official investigation explored every possible scenario, each one seeming to unravel against the bizarrely peaceful tableau. The most widely accepted theory involves a simple, tragic accident with a devastating domino effect. Perhaps one of the men was fishing from the stern and somehow fell overboard. In an instant of heroic reflex, a second man might have lunged to grab him, also falling into the water. The third man, seeing his companions in peril, could have thrown a life ring or jumped in himself in a desperate attempt to help, not realizing the boat was still in gear and slowly moving away from them. In the open ocean, even a few meters of separation can become an insurmountable distance. The catamaran, set on autopilot, would have continued its serene journey without them, leaving the three men to succumb to the sea, their cries for help swallowed by the wind and waves. Other explanations point to the ocean's unpredictable violence. The area is known for sudden, powerful squalls that can appear with little warning. A freak wave could have swept one or more of the men over the side in a single, devastating blow. Or they could have encountered trouble with the boat's rigging, and while attempting to fix a tangled sail or line, a sudden jolt sent them tumbling into the water. The psychological theory of a shared folie à trois or a sudden mass suicide was floated but quickly dismissed. The men were excited about their journey, had recently stocked up on supplies, and had no history of mental illness or motive to vanish. The Cas II remains a haunting, modern-day Mary Celeste, a pristine ship that became a floating tomb for a mystery. It stands as a stark reminder that even with all our modern technology and navigation equipment, the sea retains its ancient, indifferent power, capable of rewriting a story of a leisurely cruise into a permanent, unanswered question. From the chilling modern mystery of the Cas II, we now journey back through millennia to the very bedrock of disappearance legends, a story so powerful it has captivated humanity for over 2,000 years. We venture into the realm of myth and speculation, to a civilization that may never have existed, yet whose vanishing act is the most famous in all of history, the lost city of Atlantis. Unlike every other case we've explored, there is no missing persons report, no physical evidence to examine, no grieving family seeking answers. Our only source is a series of philosophical dialogues written by the ancient Greek thinker Plato around 360 BC. In his works Timaeus and Critias, Plato introduces Atlantis not as a myth, but as a historical reality, a cautionary tale about the hubris of nations. He describes it as a formidable naval power that lay in front of the Pillars of Hercules, what we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. This was an island empire larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined, a utopian society endowed with immense wealth, advanced technology, and majestic architecture. Its people were the descendants of the god Poseidon, and for generations they were wise and just, but over time their divine nature became diluted with their mortal humanity, and they grew corrupt, arrogant, and militaristic. They set their sights on conquering the entire Mediterranean until they were finally stopped by the only city that could stand against them, the Proto-Athens of Plato's story. According to the narrative, it was after this failed campaign that the gods decided to punish Atlantis for its wickedness. Plato writes, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. This single, vivid line is the genesis of the entire legend. A thriving, advanced civilization wiped off the map in a cataclysmic 24-hour period, swallowed whole by the ocean and lost for all time. For Plato, this was the perfect ending for his parable about a society that lost its way. But for centuries of readers that followed, it was not an ending, but a beginning, the ultimate historical cold case, a puzzle begging to be solved. The first and most critical question is whether Plato intended for anyone to believe Atlantis was real. Many scholars argue that he was simply using a compelling story to illustrate his philosophical points about ideal states and the dangers of imperialism, much like a modern novelist creating a fictional setting to make a larger point. He placed Atlantis far in the distant past, around 9,000 years before his own time, and placed it beyond the known world, making it impossible for his contemporaries to verify or debunk. Furthermore, no other ancient Greek historian or geographer prior to Plato ever mentions such a place, which is strange for a civilization supposedly powerful enough to threaten Athens. Yet, the human desire for discovery is a powerful force, and the romantic notion of a lost world has proven irresistible. This has led to a breathtaking array of theories about its real-world location, each proponent believing they have cracked Plato's code. Some researchers have taken his geographical clues literally and searched the Atlantic Ocean, pointing to underwater formations like the Azores Plateau as a possible remnant of the sunken continent. Others, noting that Plato said it was in front of the Pillars of Hercules, have looked just outside the Mediterranean, with southern Spain and Morocco being popular candidates. One particularly compelling theory suggests Atlantis was actually the Minoan civilization on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BC. Thera was devastated by one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The cataclysm would have been witnessed by the wider Mediterranean world, and it utterly destroyed the Minoan settlement on the island with earthquakes and tsunamis that would have ravaged coastal cities across the region. This event matches Plato's description of a sudden, violent end delivered by the forces of nature. The timeline is wrong, but proponents suggest the story could have been distorted as it was passed down over the centuries. The search has sprawled across the globe, with passionate advocates placing Atlantis everywhere from the Caribbean to Antarctica. Some have even reinterpreted Plato's text to suggest he was describing a location not in the Atlantic, but in the Mediterranean itself, with islands like Sardinia or Cyprus proposed as candidates. The lack of any definitive evidence has only fueled the speculation, allowing the legend to adapt and endure. The disappearance of Atlantis is unique because it represents a metaphysical vanishing. It's not just the loss of people or a ship, but the complete eradication of an entire world, a culture, and its knowledge. It taps into a deep, almost primal fear of cataclysm and a longing for a golden age lost to time. This story has driven explorers to scour the depths of the ocean and historians to decipher ancient texts. It has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film, becoming a foundational trope of the science fiction and fantasy genres. The power of Atlantis is not in its reality, but in its possibility. It is the ultimate historical ghost, a shimmering mirage on the horizon of human history that continues to beckon us forward, urging us to look just a little deeper, to wonder what other secrets the past might be hiding beneath the waves. Leaving behind the sunken legend of Atlantis, we now turn to a mystery carved not from myth but from stone, a real-world vanishing that has echoed through the canyons of the American Southwest for over 700 years. Here, in the arid landscapes of what is now the Four Corners region, an ancient people known as the ancestral Pueblones, often called by the Navajo word Anasazi, meaning ancient enemies or ancient ones, built one of the most remarkable civilizations of pre-Columbian North America. By the year 1300, their society had reached an astounding level of sophistication. They constructed vast, intricate housing complexes tucked into sheer cliff faces, like the breathtaking Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, with its over 150 rooms and 23 kivas or ceremonial chambers. They engineered sophisticated irrigation systems to farm maize, beans, and squash in a demanding desert environment. Their network of roads and trade routes spanned hundreds of miles, connecting communities and cultures. Then, within a remarkably short period, they were gone. They walked away from their magnificent stone cities, leaving behind tools, pottery, and even food stores, as if they intended to return any moment. They never did, so what could have caused such a widespread and sudden exodus from these carefully built homes? The most compelling and widely supported theory points to a catastrophic and prolonged drought. Tree ring data, a scientific method called dendrochronology, reveals that the region was struck by a devastating megadrought that lasted for several decades, precisely coinciding with the period of abandonment. For a culture dependent on agriculture in an already marginal environment, a sustained period of little rain would have been a death sentence. Crops would have failed, water sources would have dried up, and the once reliable strategies for survival would have crumbled. The social contract, built on the ability to store and share surplus food, would have fractured under the strain of hunger and scarcity. This environmental catastrophe is seen as the primary engine that forced the people to leave, a slow-burning disaster that ultimately demanded a desperate final solution. Yet, climate change alone may not tell the whole story. There is compelling archaeological evidence that this period was also one of extreme social unrest and violence. At some sites, like the Castle Rock Pueblo, researchers have found evidence of a terrible massacre. Human remains show clear signs of trauma from weapons, and some bones display evidence of being cooked and dismembered, suggesting cannibalism or ritualized violence. Defensive structures appear, with settlements built in increasingly inaccessible locations, like high cliff alcoves that were difficult to reach. This suggests that communities were not just fleeing a changing climate, but were also defending themselves from each other. Perhaps the drought sparked brutal resource wars, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a deadly struggle for the last remaining food and water. The society may have collapsed from within, torn apart by its own people in a final, violent struggle for survival. A third perspective weaves these threads of climate and conflict into a more complex tapestry of social and religious upheaval. Some archaeologists point to changes in the material culture found in the final periods of occupation. There appears to be a shift away from the large, communal great kivas that once served as the spiritual heart of a village toward smaller, more private ceremonial spaces. This could indicate a fracturing of the old religious order, a loss of faith in the spiritual leaders who could not bring the rain. The entire worldview of the people, which had sustained them for centuries, may have collapsed alongside their environment. Facing starvation, violence, and a profound spiritual crisis, the only path forward was to literally walk away from the old world and its failing ways. They did not vanish into thin air, they migrated. They traveled south and east, joining existing communities or establishing new ones. Their descendants are believed to be the modern Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, such as the Hopi and the Zuni, whose oral histories and cultural traditions speak of this very journey from a previous world. The magnificent cliff dwellings were not tombs, but waypoints in a long story of adaptation and resilience. The mystery of the Anasazi is not a whodunit, but a profound story of human response to unimaginable pressure. It's a reminder that even the greatest of civilizations are not permanent, and that sometimes the most powerful act of survival is not to fight for a dying home, but to have the courage to leave it behind and begin again. From the silent, sun-baked ruins of the American Southwest, we now journey into a world of utter, frozen silence, a landscape so hostile and remote that it kept its secrets locked in ice for over a century and a half. In May 1845, two of the most technologically advanced ships in the Royal Navy, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set sail from England under the command of the seasoned Arctic explorer Sir John Franklin. Their mission was one of the last great quests of the Age of Exploration, to find and navigate the elusive Northwest Passage, a legendary sea route through the Arctic archipelago that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The ships were marvels of Victorian engineering, reinforced with iron plating and powered by revolutionary steam engines that drove retractable propellers. They were stocked with a 3-year supply of provisions, including thousands of canned goods, a recent innovation that was supposed to guarantee their health and survival. The 129 officers and crew were the best and brightest, selected for their experience and fortitude. The expedition was a monumental undertaking, a symbol of British confidence and imperial ambition. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay in late July, heading into the labyrinth of ice-choked channels. Then the Arctic swallowed them whole. For years there was only silence. As the expedition failed to report back, the Admiralty in London grew increasingly concerned, launching what would become the longest search and rescue operation in history. The first clues were fragmentary and chilling. Inuit hunters, the only people who inhabited those frozen shores, began to tell stories to the search parties. They spoke of white men who had been seen dragging sleds south across the ice, their faces gaunt with hunger. They told of a ship that had been crushed by the ice and sunk in deep water, and of another that had been abandoned and later drifted, trapped in the pack ice. For decades, these oral histories were often dismissed by Victorian officials as the unreliable tales of a primitive people. Time would prove them to be remarkably, devastatingly accurate. The first solid evidence came from a stone cairn on King William Island, discovered in 1859. Inside was a single faded note which contained 2 messages. The first, dated May 1847, reported that all was well and that they were wintering near the island. The second, scrawled in the margins a year later, told a horrifyingly different story. It reported that Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847, that the ships had been trapped in the ice for over a year and a half, and that the crew had abandoned them. Most hauntingly, it ended with the news that the survivors were setting out the next day to walk to the Back River, over 1,000 kilometers to the south. It was signed by the expedition's final leader, Captain Francis Crozier, and it was the last written word ever received from any of the 129 men. The fate of those who began that death march is where the real horror lies. The graves of 3 crewmen who died early on, discovered on Beechey Island, were perfectly preserved by the permafrost and offered the first forensic clues. Autopsies performed in the 1980s revealed staggeringly high levels of lead in their bodies. The source was almost certainly the expedition's own provisions. The thousands of tin cans soldered with lead had been poisoning the men slowly, meal by meal. Lead poisoning causes a host of debilitating symptoms: severe abdominal pain, lethargy, paralysis, and most dangerously, erratic behavior and poor judgment. Imagine trying to make life or death decisions in the most brutal environment on Earth while your mind is being clouded by toxic heavy metals. This was compounded by the specter of scurvy, the ancient scourge of sailors, caused by a lack of vitamin C. Despite their canned food, they lacked the fresh meat that could have prevented it. The disease causes old wounds to reopen, teeth to fall out, and profound weakness, making the very act of walking a monumental effort. This is where the Inuit testimony becomes not just credible but essential. Their accounts described encountering small groups of emaciated, desperate men, some of whom were clearly suffering from scurvy, dragging a boat on a sled across the uneven ice. They spoke of finding campsites with evidence of cannibalism, bones that had been cracked open to access the marrow, the last resort of the starving. For over a century, this was vehemently denied by British authorities, who considered such an act a profound taboo that their brave men could never have committed. But modern forensic analysis of human bones found on King William Island confirms cut marks consistent with butchering, proving the Inuit stories were tragically true. The men, driven mad by hunger, lead, and scurvy, had resorted to the unthinkable to survive. The final chapters of the Franklin expedition were only fully written in the 21st century. In 2014 and 2016, the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were finally discovered at the bottom of the Arctic Sea. their locations remarkably close to the areas described in Inuit oral history. The pristine condition of the ships, particularly the Terror, which was found sitting upright on the seabed as if gently laid to rest, offered new clues but also deepened the mystery. Their discovery confirmed the ultimate fate of the vessels but left the personal stories of the crew's final days forever frozen in time. The Franklin story is more than a simple tale of explorers getting lost. It is a complex tragedy of human ambition clashing with an unforgiving environment, of cutting-edge technology failing at a critical moment, and of a cultural arrogance that initially blinded rescuers to the vital truths held by the people who knew that land best. It stands as a stark, icy monument to the limits of human endurance and the enduring power of a story, even one whispered on the Arctic wind for generations before it was finally believed. Yet another wealthy and powerful man vanishes just as his life reaches a pivotal moment, leaving behind a fortune and a trail of suspicion that would never grow cold. On December 2, 1919, Canadian theatre magnate Ambrose Small completed the business deal of a lifetime. He sold his vast empire of theatres, a chain that stretched across Ontario, for a sum equivalent to over $20 million in today's money. The cash was deposited into his account at the Canadian Bank of Commerce in Toronto. That evening, he was seen at his office going over some final details. He then met with his wife, Teresa, and together they went to the Grand Opera House, one of the crown jewels of his theatrical holdings, to collect a $10,000 donation for the Catholic Church. Afterwards, he returned to his office to retrieve his overcoat, and at around 5:45 in the evening, he told his secretary he was going out for a walk. Ambrose Small, one of the most recognizable and influential men in Canada, stepped out onto Yonge Street and vanished into the twilight, never to be seen again. The initial reaction was not one of immediate panic. Small was a flamboyant and sometimes volatile character, known for his temper and his erratic behavior. It was thought he might have simply taken a sudden trip to blow off steam after the stressful sail. But as days turned into weeks with no word, and with that immense fortune sitting untouched in his bank account, the reality of his disappearance sank in. The investigation that followed was a spectacle in itself, fueled by a $50,000 reward offered by his wife. It quickly became a media frenzy, with every tip and rumor splashed across the front pages. The case was a Pandora's box of motives and potential suspects, each theory more compelling than the last. The first and most obvious person of interest was his wife, Teresa Small. Their marriage was known to be deeply troubled and fraught with arguments. Ambrose was a notorious womanizer, and Teresa had reportedly threatened him in the past. The fact that she stood to inherit his entire fortune provided a powerful motive. Yet, she was the one who pushed the police the hardest to investigate and offered the enormous reward, behavior inconsistent with someone who had orchestrated a murder. Then there were his business associates. The sale of the theater chain was complex and had made enemies. Had Small double-crossed someone in the deal? Was he killed by a rival businessman or perhaps by someone within his own organization who felt cheated? The theory of a professional hit was always on the table, given the clean and absolute nature of the vanishing. This leads to the other persistent theory, that Ambrose Small orchestrated his own disappearance. He was a man under immense pressure, trapped in a bad marriage, and suddenly in possession of a life-changing amount of money. Did he decide to simply walk away from it all? Perhaps he had a secret plan to retrieve the money later from a different location under a new identity. The problem with this theory is that he never touched a cent of it. The fortune remained in the bank, gathering dust for the rest of his wife's life. If it was a plan to start over, it was a plan he never activated, which makes the voluntary disappearance theory feel incomplete at best. Over the decades, the case took on a macabre and almost gothic life of its own. Tips poured in for years, from psychic visions to deathbed confessions, but none led to a body or a conviction. The most famous clue emerged years later when a convicted murderer and bank robber named John Doughty, who had been Small's former secretary, confessed to the crime. He claimed he had been alone in the office with Small. They had argued over a $500 bonus he felt he was owed from the big sale, and in a fit of rage he struck and killed him. He then allegedly dragged the body to the furnace room of the Grand Opera House and incinerated it. While this confession seemed to solve the mystery, it was riddled with inconsistencies. He couldn't accurately describe the layout of the building's basement, and no physical evidence was ever found to corroborate his story. The police ultimately did not charge him, leaving his confession as just another eerie, unverified chapter in the legend. The disappearance of Ambrose Small is a classic locked room mystery played out on the scale of an entire city. It has all the elements of a perfect crime thriller: wealth, infidelity, powerful suspects, and a body that was never found. It remains Canada's most famous cold case, a ghost story written not in a remote wilderness, but in the heart of its largest city, a permanent question mark in the nation's history. From the shadowy, unresolved fate of a tycoon, we pivot to a disappearance of an entirely different nature, one that didn't involve a person vanishing into thin air, but the startling hijacking of reality itself, broadcast live into the homes of thousands of unsuspecting viewers. On the night of November 22, 1987, during the 9 o'clock news hour, viewers of Chicago's WGN television were suddenly pulled from a normal sports report into a scene of pure, surreal chaos. The broadcast was abruptly overridden by a jarring signal. A figure wearing a rubber mask of the 80s CGI personality, Max Headroom, known for his stuttering, glitchy speech, was now gyrating wildly in front of a spinning background. For nearly half a minute, the imposter remained silent, bouncing and twisting to a buzzing, unidentifiable sound before the signal abruptly cut back to a very confused sports anchor. It was a bizarre, almost laughable prank, a fleeting glimpse of weirdness that might have been forgotten as a one-off glitch, but the intruder wasn't finished. Just over 2 hours later, during a broadcast of the cult favorite show Doctor Who on the PBS affiliate WTTW, the signal was hijacked again. This time, the intrusion lasted for a full 90 seconds, a masterclass in unsettling absurdity. The same masked figure was now seated, with the iconic, grating Max Headroom laugh dubbed over his movements. He launched into a bizarre, disjointed monologue, rambling about being a prime-time gladiator and name-dropping various local TV personalities like Chuck Swirsky and Larry Lujak. He mumbled incoherent phrases, at one point singing a snippet of a Clash song, and at another quipping, "Your love is fading." The climax of this bizarre performance was as juvenile as it was shocking. An accomplice, unseen off camera, stepped into view and vigorously spanked the intruder with a fly swatter while he pleaded, "They're coming to get me." The feed then cut to a test pattern, and just like that, the strangest broadcast piracy in American history was over. The intruder and his accomplice vanished back into the night, having pulled off a brazen, technically complex crime that to this day has never been solved. The brilliance and the enduring mystery of the Max Headroom incident lies not in its sophomoric humor, but in the sheer technical proficiency it required. Hijacking a broadcast signal from a major television station is not a simple feat. In the analog age of 1987, it required a deep understanding of radio frequency engineering and access to highly specialized, powerful, and expensive equipment. The prevailing theory is that the hijacker operated from a location with a clear line of sight to the transmission tower of each station, likely a high hill or a tall building. From there, they would have used a high-power transmitter to broadcast their own signal on the exact same frequency as the station, effectively overpowering the legitimate broadcast. The intruder's signal was slightly weaker than the original, which is why some viewers reported seeing a ghost image of the pirate broadcast superimposed over the real one, a phenomenon that only adds to the event's eerie, otherworldly quality. This was not the work of a random hacker. It was an operation conducted by someone with significant expertise, someone who knew precisely how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the era's broadcast technology. Despite the very public nature of the crime and a full investigation by the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the perpetrators were never caught. The few clues they left behind were frustratingly cryptic. The rambling audio contained potential leads, the name-dropping of local celebrities, the song lyrics, but these all proved to be dead ends, likely inside jokes or deliberate misdirection. The fly swatter, the mask, the silly voices, it all pointed to a prank, a performance art piece designed for maximum absurdity rather than any clear political or financial motive. This has led many to believe the primary goal was simply the challenge itself, the ultimate geek flex to prove it could be done. Over the years, amateur sleuths and journalists have pursued theories, even naming potential suspects within the Chicago area radio and engineering communities, but without any hard evidence, these remain speculative. The Max Headroom broadcast intrusion stands as a perfect, unsolved digital age crime. It was a victimless prank that left behind no body, no stolen goods, and no ransom note. Only a profoundly weird cultural artifact and a lingering question about the identity of the clever, eccentric mind who managed to hijack the airwaves for a fleeting moment of glorious, inexplicable nonsense. But before we dive into the final disappearance on our list, we must first step away from the world of ancient legends and into the gritty, real-world underworld of organized labor and organized crime. Our final story is one of power, corruption, and a vanishing so absolute it has become a cultural punchline, yet remains one of the most investigated missing persons cases in American history. The man at the center of it all was James Riddle Hoffa, a name that was synonymous with the American labor movement. As the fiercely charismatic and notoriously ruthless president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, he commanded one of the largest and most powerful unions in the world. But his influence was a double-edged sword. By the summer of 1975, Hoffa's power was waning. He had recently been released from federal prison after a presidential committal, and he was fighting to regain control of the union from the successors he believed had betrayed him. He was a man who knew too many secrets and was seen as a dangerous loose end by his former allies in both the Union and the Mafia. On July 30, 1975, Hoffa drove to the parking lot of the Matches Red Fox restaurant in a Detroit suburb. He was there for what he believed was a reconciliation meeting with two men, Anthony Giacalone, a powerful Detroit mob figure, and Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters boss and former close associate. Hoffa was a creature of habit and punctuality. He arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon for a 2:30 meeting. The men he was supposed to meet never showed up. Witnesses last saw him around 3 o'clock, apparently annoyed, getting into a maroon car believed to be a 1973 Mercury Marquis with 2 or 3 other men. He was never seen or heard from again. His disappearance was so sudden and so complete that it defied all logic. Here was one of the most recognizable men in America, a man with countless enemies, vanishing from a busy parking lot in broad daylight without a single reliable witness to his actual abduction. The only trace left behind was his car, parked and empty. The immediate and enduring assumption was that Jimmy Hoffa was the victim of a mob-ordered hit. He knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. He could have implicated dozens of high-ranking organized crime figures in the Teamsters' massive pension fund skimming operations and other illicit activities. His attempts to regain power were seen as a direct threat to the new, quieter, and more profitable status quo. The question was never really if he was killed, but how, by whom, and most tantalizingly, where did they put the body? The search for Hoffa's remains became a national obsession, yielding a seemingly endless stream of theories, tips, and false alarms, each more colorful than the last. One of the most persistent early theories placed him under the end zone of Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, which was under construction at the time of his disappearance and had concrete poured daily. This theory was fueled by Provenzano's New Jersey connections, but multiple excavations over the years, including one by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1989, found nothing. Another theory suggested his body was crushed into scrap metal at a Florida car compactor owned by a mob associate. A different account from a supposed hitman claimed he was cremated in a Detroit area mob-owned funeral home. Perhaps the most bizarre theory came from a former police officer who claimed Hoffa was buried beneath the swimming pool of a home in suburban Detroit, leading to a highly publicized dig in 2003 that, like all the others, yielded no evidence. For decades, tipsters have pointed to fields, basements, and waterways across the country, but each excavation has come up empty. The most credible accounts from within the mafia itself point to a much simpler and grimmer disposal method. According to these confessions, Hoffa was shot twice in the back of the head at a house only a short drive from the restaurant. His body was then placed in a steel drum, which was either welded shut or filled with concrete, and transported to a mob-controlled garbage hauler. From there, he was likely taken to a private landfill and buried under thousands of tons of refuse, or perhaps even incinerated in a giant compactor. In a cruel twist of irony, the very industry his union-controlled waste management provided the perfect means for his permanent disappearance. The mystery endures not because we don't know what happened to him, but because we can never truly know. The complete lack of a body has denied both justice and closure. It transformed Jimmy Hoffa from a man into a permanent specter, a cautionary tale about the price of power and the dangerous alliances required to attain it. His legacy is a paradox, a man who fought fiercely for the rights of the working class while simultaneously enriching and empowering some of the most vicious criminals in American history. His disappearance was the final, dramatic act of a life lived in the shadows, a perfect crime executed so flawlessly that it continues to captivate and confound us nearly half a century later. He is the ghost that haunts the American dream, a reminder that some secrets are buried so deep they are never meant to be found. What unites these 25 stories, from the sunken ruins of forgotten cities to the silent, pristine decks of ghost ships, is the profound and unsettling silence they leave in their wake. Each case is a stark reminder of the fragile line between presence and absence, a thread that can be severed by a simple misjudgment, a sudden storm, the cruel hand of another, or forces we may never comprehend. We see eerie patterns emerge across the centuries: the confident explorer who underestimates the wilderness, the powerful figure who becomes a threat to his own allies, the ordinary person who steps out on a routine errand into a void. These are not just historical footnotes, they are profound human tragedies that force us to confront the limits of our knowledge and control. We are a species driven to solve puzzles, to bring order to chaos, and these mysteries represent the ultimate rebellion against that desire. They are the unanswered questions that keep us awake at night, the historical cold cases that refuse to be closed. Perhaps we are so captivated because these vanishings hold up a mirror to our own deepest anxieties. They tap into a primal fear of being lost, of being forgotten, of a story left forever unfinished. In a modern world of satellites and surveillance, where we are more connected than ever, these tales whisper that the map still has its edges, that the unknown hasn't been entirely banished. They remind us that history is not a neat collection of facts, but a sprawling, messy narrative filled with gaps and shadows where entire lives can simply disappear. The search for answers, whether through scientific inquiry, historical research, or simply the act of retelling the story, is a testament to our need for closure, our desire to restore the narrative and grant peace to those left behind. So as the stories of the Roanoke colonists, the passengers of Flight 19, and Jimmy Hoffa fade from our screen, they don't truly leave us. They linger in the imagination, challenging us to piece together the clues ourselves, to wonder about the countless other stories that were lost to time without a single witness. These 25 cases are but a fraction of history's great unanswered questions, each one a haunting melody that ends on a dissonant chord. They remind us that some doors, once closed, can never be reopened. Now we turn the question over to you. Which of these disappearances haunts your thoughts the most? Is it the desperate final walk of the Franklin crew, the suburban normalcy of the Springfield Three, or the enigmatic final broadcast of the Max Headroom pirate? Share your thoughts in the comments below and keep the conversation and the search for answers alive.